Okay, I'm going to tell you a secret. I actually had a life before psychology. And in that life, I was a high-tech venture capitalist and a former Silicon Valley executive. And I tell you that because I'm going to give you some examples, some stories later that come from that era of my life. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is resilience. And resilience in the context of my specialty in psychology, which is trauma. So, once upon a time, the world felt safe to us. When we went to church, we knew we were going to be okay. We were going to be safe. We could go to work, we could go to school, we could travel at the airport, we could go and have a meal at a restaurant, and we would pretty much feel like we were pretty safe. But today, things are different. And there's trauma risk wherever we go now. So there's various types of trauma, obviously, right? So there's occupational, what I call occupational trauma, which is if you have a job like a firefighter or a first responder, police, military, it's inherent in that job that you're going to experience some things that are going to be not very pleasant, that may have lifelong impact on you. There's natural disaster trauma, and of course in Colorado, we've had more than our fair share of that. That's the fires and floods and tornadoes and hurricanes, and I'm going to talk later about earthquakes. And then there's the trauma that comes from terrorism, which has been in the news a lot lately. The school shootings, Columbine as an early example. And then there's interpersonal trauma, which is things like rape, sexual assault, things that basically violate our very fundamental being, our physical being. Just like a heart attack, trauma cannot be predicted most of the time. So Thomas Swift, when he went to work on September 11th, I worked at Morgan Stanley in the World Trade Center. I am fairly certain he did not think on his way to work, I won't make it home tonight. It was a totally unexpected, unpredicted, unpredictable situation for him. Biomedical researcher Steve Wolfenden, he was pushing his little boy in a stroller, enjoying the day when Leo's mom was actually running the Boston Marathon. And I'm sure that Steve did not wake up that morning and say, something really bad's going to happen to me and my son today. I said earlier that we've had our fair share of natural disaster trauma here, and the Waldo Canyon fire, Black Forest fires are examples of that. But in 2012, we were all going about our business, having our usual things that we do every day. And all of a sudden, with a shift of the wind, lots and lots of people had very little notice to get out of harm's way. And so while there was you could tell that there was something dangerous going on, you didn't know until kind of the last minute that you were going to be losing everything. And then October 17th, 1989, this Mr. James Hansen, he left work early that day because he wanted to go home and watch the World Series. And I'm sure that when he jumped in the car to head home to watch the World Series, he had no idea that he would perish in the collapse of the Cypress structure in the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989. That was a 7.1 earthquake. So it's all around us. And for the research that we've been doing with secondary traumatic stress, what we've found in our research is that the average number of traumatic events that we will experience in a lifetime is about 3. So it's not, it's not generally something that you're not going to experience at some point. We all will have experiences. So given that, how can we flourish, since that's our theme tonight, how can we flourish in this new reality? So I think many of us in the behavioral health, mental health field believe that resilience is one of the qualities or characteristics that helps us work through and address and deal with and process some of these traumatic events that happen to us through our lifetime. So resilience, that's the process of adapting in the face of trauma, tragedy, significant sources of stress. It's about bouncing back from experiences. So some people may think that resilience is actually extraordinary, but it's actually very ordinary, very common. And resilience doesn't mean that, that you don't experience some distress, emotional reactions, pain, suffering from the experience. What it does mean is that you can develop thoughts, behaviors, ways of looking at the world that allow you to process the experience that you've had and be able to continue on in life. So that begged the question for me about what does that say about what leadership should understand about trauma? And I say this because many of these traumatic experiences happen in the context of our workplace, the World Trade Center, that kind of thing. So what should leadership, what do they have to know and understand really to help the team that they're working with develop resilience and move past the experience and maybe even be better for it? So the first thing I think they need to understand, we need to understand as leaders, is that there's really 2 types of trauma. One is what I'll call a primary trauma, and that's when something has happened to you directly, right? You have experienced something that's really difficult. So when you have a primary trauma, the very normal initial reaction to that experience is that you develop this sort of sense of being numb, of things are kind of surreal, your mind can't really wrap around what's going on. And in the long term, in some cases, you would develop what we all PTSD, post-traumatic stress symptoms, okay? Then there's the secondary traumatic stress. And secondary traumatic stress is very much like primary trauma response, except that it comes from working with people who have had trauma. So I'm a psychologist, and I work with a lot of military people who have experienced combat trauma, military sexual assault, work with first responders who have had to respond to some pretty horrific situations, work with first responders who are carrying a tremendous amount of guilt because they didn't feel like they did enough. And in the course of working with these people, I'm being constantly exposed to the intimate detail of their experience. And with secondary trauma, I start developing the same symptoms that someone would have from primary trauma. So that's why we call it secondary trauma. So secondary traumatic stress is what we've been studying, or what we studied in one of the projects here that I worked on at UCCS. With secondary trauma, it's a little bit different in that you have the same sense of like surreal experience, you're having a hard time kind of understanding what you're experiencing. But the longer term effects of that tend to be more like compassion fatigue. I'm having a hard time having compassion for people now, which in my business is a bad thing. So you start developing symptoms that are very similar to the trauma response, except that you didn't personally have that trauma. And I can tell you that there are times when at the end of a day, I could not hear another war story because it was just too much. And I worked a lot with soldiers out of Fort Carson. And that Fort Carson has four brigades of the 4th Infantry Division, and those are the guys that when they deployed, they'd go do route clearance and, break the doors down and stuff like that. So the stories that they have are very different than the stories of someone who worked in the Air Force, for example, and was less directly involved with the enemy. So the stories that come from there are really hard to work with. And then when you're working with multiple people from this environment, you come to realize that you're hearing the same incident from about 4 or 5 different perspectives. And it just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. So secondary trauma comes from being exposed to the trauma, but not directly, but through working with people who have been exposed to trauma. So we see this as psychologists. We see this a lot of times with people who work in domestic violence arenas, people working in trying to help out people with getting away from human trafficking. So there's a lot of different types of helpers or people in the helping profession who can develop the secondary trauma. So I want to tell you a little bit about a story about my experience, and that was when I was in Silicon Valley. I was the worldwide vice president of services for a software company. And we have a usual annual user conference where everybody comes in from all around the world to San Francisco or the Bay Area. And we have this big conference with thousands and thousands of people. And of course, in my position, I have played a pretty important role in terms of presenting and talking about how wonderful our software is and how much we love them as customers. So imagine for a moment now, and you're sitting there and you're listening to me, and you're probably pretty relaxed in the chair. And imagine if all of a sudden that bank of lights fell down. Okay, so in some ways, when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, that's what happened. Well, I'm having a nice glass of Perrier with a coworker, and all of a sudden, the building is shaking. You cannot get up to walk because the floor is moving too much, and it throws you down. And the fight or flight thing is kind of like really strong right now, right? And you're just trying to figure out how to get safe. Meanwhile, lights are falling down. Mirrored things in the walls are falling down and crashing on the marble floor and setting shards all over the place. So this was my experience in the Loma Prieta earthquake. Now, when that happens, you can't quite wrap your mind around what's happening. Because usually when I stand up, I can walk. If I'm in danger, I can get myself to safety. And wait a minute, the whole place is shaking, and all these people are at risk, and I'm at risk, and so you're not thinking rationally, right? Because your fight or flight system's engaged. So after having an experience like that, the response of leadership in the company was, Valerie, we want you to stay here overnight, and we want you tomorrow to do all the presentations for all the people who are now going to go home to their families because they can. And so there was no recognition of the fact that I'm basically a zombie. And you're going to ask me to get up in front of whoever's left, because to tell you the truth, a lot of people grabbed rental cars and drove to LA to get home. but I'm being asked to get up, put all of what's going on for me aside, and do the job. So that's why I think it's important that leadership understand that when you're presented with a traumatic incident, that there are certain things that you can do to help build resilience, and there are certain things that you can do to make matters worse. So for primary trauma, what we found, and what you'll see in the research, is the top 3 factors for building resilience for primary trauma survivors is number 1 is social support, being around other people. Now, for me personally, that's a tough concept because I'm a raging introvert and I don't want to be around people. But social support was very important in my process of trying to figure out what had just happened to me. And what happens right after an incident like that is people want to talk about it a lot, over and over and over and over. And people who haven't experienced it think, oh, this is really boring, can you shut up about it now? But people who have been through it understand we just need to talk about it with each other. The second is self-efficacy, and that's the idea that, that we have confidence in our ability to be able to process or work with or cope with the trauma that we've just experienced. And then the third, which is kind of was weird to me at first, but people who have had a pattern of stressors have over their lifetime developed ways of coping with stressors. So that helps them become more resilient when things happen. I found that also, even in my clinical work, that people who have had no significant stressors, when they do have their first trauma, they don't know what to do because they haven't developed a way for themselves to be able to process through and get through the experience. For secondary traumatic stress, and again, burnout is one of the things that also happens as a result of secondary traumatic stress. Again, social support is number 1. The second is supervisor support, which is something I didn't have, but this is relevant in a lot of work environments. Understanding from your supervisors that what you're going through and what you might need. And then this whole notion of work-life balance and making efforts to take care of yourself, right? So we as clinicians, when we're spending 8-10 hours a day helping people with traumatic experience, we need to have something in our lives besides what we're doing for a living. So we can't, the work has to be what we do, but not what we are. And then exposure to terror, one of the things I think that we've learned through some of the experiences that we've had is there's a temptation when there's a terror incident to listen to the news and have it on, and we're watching it, and we're listening to it, and we're talking about, did you see this? Oh my God. And we've got the TV on the whole time, and we're just re-experiencing it, right? And especially for kids, this is really difficult because kids can't differentiate that what they're seeing is something that happened in the past. They think it's happening over and over right now. But to take a news break, okay, even though it's tempting to want to keep watching it, taking a news break and just kind of, stepping away from it for a while can be helpful. Keeping things in perspective that, yes, bad things do happen, but they don't always happen. That sometimes if you have a plan of what you would do if something happened for you in that moment, what would you do? And we've been doing a lot of planning about this in the clinic. As I'm sure you can imagine, we are seeing a lot of survivors from things like the Planned Parenthood shootings. And so the clinic now has developed our protocol for what would happen if there was an active shooter in our building. Okay? So having that plan gives us a little bit more confidence that we can handle things in the future. And then helping others and staying connected with the people who are important in our lives. So I talk about trauma, and I talk about resilience and post-traumatic stress, but actually it's quite often the case that as a result of a traumatic experience, we achieve actually personal growth from that experience. And so there's this idea that there is this thing called post-traumatic growth that comes from having some of these experiences. And so that's looking at the positive side, as we heard in the previous presentation. So, in my mind, and I think in the minds of many, that really the key to flourishing in this really unpredictable world, where we can't predict what's going to happen to us, and some of the things that do happen to us are really bad. The key, since we can't stop it, is to develop resilience so that we're able to process what's happened and grow from it and move forward in our lives. Thank you very much.